Hey everyone, Howie Fisher with Fisher's Flies. Thanks for checking in. This is episode 4 of my Fulling Mill 2025 catalog series, and this is Kutzer's Crafty Swinger. So this is obviously a swing fly for spay style and so on. To get started, I'm using a Spawn 25 millimeter shank, and I'm going to bend this with a pair of pliers. I don't have any Intruder style shanks, so I'm just going to make my own, and this works just fine. So the key with an Intruder style shank is really just that bend in the front, and it keeps the tip of the fly up as you're swinging it across. I'm using Veevus GSP 100 denier, or gel spun polypropylene. I'm going to go ahead and get started and snip my thread and then lay down a base of thread while closing the gap on that hook shank. And we're not going to need the back end of this because we're going to tie on our wire. We're not going to loop in a hook or anything like that. So I'm using a Daiichi Intruder hook. This is a 2557 in size 4 and Senyo Intruder wire in this small size. So this is for size 6 hooks or smaller. So I've got a piece. I'm going to double it over. And this is probably one of the more difficult parts of Intruder flies, is getting, in my opinion at least, is getting the wire through the hole and getting it through the right way. So one way that I like to think about it is you want your fly, or you want your wire to go in parallel to the hook shank. So you can see now the wire is parallel before I wrap it up and over. If you put it in the other way with the hook eye pointing up, it's going the wrong way. If you want that hook to ride hook point up and the wire to be in line with the hook shank. Next, I'm going to take my wire, and on this specific fly, I'm going to put my wire on either side. I'm going to make it about a shank in length. And so I'm going to take 2 or 3 wraps and then make sure my wire's in the right place where I want it. This is the perfect time to do that. And I want this wire to just sit on either side of that shank. So you can see how it's coming off the back end of this is perfectly in line with the shank itself. I'm going to wrap my thread forward, and I cut a couple of these wires ahead of time, and so I have the length exactly how I want it. So I'm going to wrap this up a little bit, and then I'm going to bend the extra backwards. And I did this just so I don't have to come in and cut anything, but I'm also going to add a little bit of Zap-A-Gap Thin. And again, just cover over everything. Make sure it's not going anywhere. No fish is going to pull this out. It's already going to be a hard time if a fish tries or, is close to pulling this out. But really, with that wire bent over like that, it shouldn't ever come out. But just adding some glue for added security. Next, I'm going to add some flat diamond braid in pearl. And so one part of this fly is you're going to add an underwing here. So it's a 2-part step. You're going to tie this in with some of the flat braid pointing back, and you're tying it to about the bend of the hook itself. And then you're going to bring the excess over the rest of that flat wire back, and we're going to tie this off facing backwards, and we'll use it later. But first, I'm going to add some 0.025 lead-free wire for some weight. And you want to add this about the middle of the shank towards the backish. 1, this is going to build up the body, but 2, it is also going to give you space to finish the fly. So you don't want it to go too far forward, otherwise it's going to make your head a little bit more bulky. You really only want about 5 to 8 wraps, according to Pete, the creator of this fly, just enough to give it a little extra weight to get down. So next I'm going to grab that flat wire that I left hanging off the back, and I'm going to wrap this forward. And once I've got this wrapped to about the 2/3 point of this shank, I'm going to tie it off and cut it off. So as you can see, again, you want to leave about 1/3 of this shank completely untouched for the head of the fly. But before I go anywhere, I'm just going to cover this in some UV resin just to add some durability, especially if you're fishing for those 2D migratory fish like salmon or steelhead or even lake run brown trout or similar, anything with teeth, just to make sure that it doesn't get torn apart. And then I'm just going to brush out or pick out these fibers it's just going to act as flash instead of adding flash glue or something similar. And again, this is also going to end up being an underwing for the craft fur on this. So the next material on this fly is going to be some red dubbing. So I'm using tactical microflash dubbing in berry from Fulling Mill. And you're going to take out a decently large clump of this. Not too much, but you want a little bit more than you think you probably might. So this is going to be the underbody, and what is important about this step is this is going to prop up the wing. So you want to make sure that you do use enough, but you don't want too much because you don't want to crowd the head of the fly, and you don't want it, again, to be just too much material in general. So I'm using a split thread dubbing loop. You can obviously use a traditional dubbing loop with a dubbing spinner as well if you'd like. I'm just going to hit this with some wax to make sure those fibers stick. I'm going to insert my dubbing. By the way, with this Fulling Mill tactical microflash dubbing, I preened out the fibers and then I tore them in half to make these fibers shorter. Specifically on this fly, that red is kind of just a hot spot of those gills. It's not meant to be a major part of this fly. So I'm going to twist that up. I'm going to brush this out, make sure none of those fibers are trapped. And then I'm going to start wrapping this forward. And again, you want to try and keep this as tight as possible. And you do want this to be bulbous. You want this to stick up. And so, because again, this is, you're going to see here in a minute, this clump of dubbing is going to be what props up the wing and ends up giving this fly a good bit of volume. And that's the case with most swing flies or traditional Atlantic salmon flies or Pacific salmon flies, is you have something underneath the head or the wing to prop it up. So next I'm going to add some lateral scale, or you can use some crystal flash, or flashaboo is what Pete uses on the original fly, but I'm just using some lateral scale to kind of mix things up a little bit. I've really been liking this Fulling Mill series for this reason, actually. Just tying up some different flies that I've never tied or wouldn't necessarily tie, and just being creative with them. So again, here I'm using lateral scale. I'm using about 4 pieces, and you're going to tie this directly on top of the fly. So not on the sides, but directly on top. And you can see here already how that dubbing ball is propping these flashaboo up. And again, starting to give this fly some volume already. Next, I'm using Salty Craft Fur in white from Fulling Mill. This is another brand new material from Fulling Mill. I don't use craft fur a ton, but from the craft fur that I own or have used, I really think Fulling Mill has knocked the ball out of the park on this one. It's a huge piece of craft fur. It's super thick. I did also actually watch a video recently from, I believe it was Trident Fly Shop out of Florida, that did a side-by-side review of 4 of the major brands. And being a saltwater fly shop in Florida, they said they felt like this was the best one. So one thing that's unique about this fly is you're going to clip off a clump of craft fur, and you're going to pull out the shorts like I'm doing right now, but you don't want to throw those away. You don't want to throw away the excess because that's actually what you're going to use to build the head. So we've got the longer fibers here. We're going to lay this on top and take 2 looser wraps. And you want this wing to sit directly on top of the hook shank. You can see it's sometimes a little bit difficult here. But again, I'm going to wrap 2 wraps, pull it on top, make sure it sits on top, and then I'm going to start pulling down on this to make sure that it stays up on top. And same thing as the flash boot, you're getting this, the dubbing ball that you built up, and it's pushing this wing, which is going to be the bait fish itself, actually. It's pushing it up and, again, giving it volume, building shape. That's one of the advantages of swing flies is that you get the shape of the fly or of the fish, the bait fish, without necessarily having all of the volume of a streamer that's packed full of rabbit hair or deer hair or marabou, for example. Next I'm using larva lace angel hair, just in pearl. But before I do that, I'm going to create a traditional dubbing loop. So whereas I used a split thread dubbing loop before, this time I'm going to use a traditional style dubbing loop where I use the thread doubled over with a dubbing twister. And again, I'm going to wax this. And the reason why I'm doing this here is because this is a bigger head and I'm going to put a larger volume of material in here. So I'm going to take some of that angel hair and break it up and mix it in with those short fibers that I set aside. Remember to don't throw those away because you're going to use those, like you can see me doing here. Mix them up with some angel hair, with some additional flash, and then stick it into this dubbing loop. And this is going to create the taper on the head of this fly, but it's also going to build up some volume. So once I get it where I want it, then I'll go ahead and twist up my dubbing spinner. And the hardest part of this process probably is making sure you don't get any of the fibers that are already on the fly trapped in it. So you want to be kind of adjusting as you go. You can see here I'm using my bodkin to pick out the flash fibers from the dubbing ball. But if you just twist it and pick them out, twist it, pick them out, you should be in good shape. So once I got that where I want it, I'm going to preen these fibers backwards with my fingers with every wrap. And you want these wraps to be touching. Again, you're trying to build up a head of a bait fish here, so you do want it to be a little bit thicker. And of course, the nice thing about this style of dubbing loop is that once you get to the head, if you have some extra left over, you can just snip it right off. So I'm going to do that a little bit here. Actually, I'm going to rewrap that because some fibers got trapped. Yeah, I don't quite like the way that turned out, so I'm going to rewrap this real quick. And again, there's no hurt in going backwards because this is the time to do it, rather than when you have already tied it off. That's obviously much more difficult. So I'm going to tie this off over top of and in front of. It's going to look messy. You're going to have fibers everywhere. You're going to have fibers trapped. That's okay. Just tie it off, preen the fibers back, and take your thread in front of. And you can give it a couple extra wraps to start to push these fibers backwards, but then come in with a dubbing brush and really give this head a good brushing. And you may even have to come in with a bodkin as well if you have any fibers that you can see that are trapped. But again, I'm going to take some more wraps in front of, and then I'm going to trim the body of this fly. And talking to Pete Kutzer, the creator of this fly, that was something that he specifically kind of pointed out is trimming that underbody to make sure that red dubbing ball shows through. Again, to act as a trigger point, but also look like gills as well, or bleeding bait fish. I'm going to whip finish now, seat my knot, and cut my thread. And just a reminder, watch that back hook as you're pushing these fibers back all over the place. You'll get yourself if you don't. I'm using 7mm pearl eyes from Fulling Mill, also another new product from them. I'm going to first start by adding some super glue, this little dollop on either side, and then add the eye. I like the gel Loctite super glue. It's pretty readily available at, a lot of stores, grocery stores, Lowe's, Home Depot, etc. You also get the gel control, and that gives you a little bit of extra time. It's not an immediate grab usually, so you have some time to slide the eye around if you need to, which of course can have its disadvantages on more tricky pieces. But I'm just going to hold that in there, make sure it stays in place where I want it. And then I'm going to grab for my UV resin. I'm going to start by putting some Solarez bone dry on these thread wraps on the head of this fly, just to make sure that this fly is bulletproof. It's not going to fall apart or unravel. And then next I'm going to grab some Solarez Flex. And this is a thicker consistency, but I'm doing this to, this is something that I prefer to do. This is not something that Pete Kutzer does, the originator of this fly, that I'm aware of. But I'm just doing this. I like to do this on my eyes, especially on these kind of flat eyes, or especially if I know I'm fishing for larger fish, which again, with a swing fly like this, I think he's originally going for migratory fish like steelhead and salmon, and so I want something a little bit more durable. So again, I'm going to put some Flex resin on here to just try and give those eyes some added durability and longevity. So once I've got that where I want it, of course, hit it with that UV resin or UV light and cure that in place. And this fly is pretty much done. I'm going to go ahead and give it one last trim, but Pete Kutzer's Crafty Swinger. This is a fun fly to tie. Tie them up, fish them. Let me know what you think. Thanks.